The scream of metal on metal was the first welcome Red Hollow offered. It was a long, tortured sound that cut through the silence of the plains, a sound of something heavy and tired being forced to stop. The year was 1887. The mail train, coated in a fine red dust that seemed to be the very blood of the land, hissed steam into the dry air, its great iron heart panting after a long journey west. Clara Hastings stood on the train steps, hesitating for a moment that felt both too short and too long. The sun was a white, merciless eye in a bleached blue sky. It beat down on the single dusty street of the town, making the warped wooden buildings shimmer in the heat. She clutched the handle of her worn leather trunk with one hand and a folded, sweat-dampened letter in the other. Her knuckles were white. This was it, the end of one life, the beginning of another. She hoped. She descended to the splintered platform, her sensible traveling boots sinking into a mixture of grit and wood dust. The air tasted of alkali and something else, something lonely. Red Hollow was not a town. It was a scar on the face of the earth, a place that clung to life with the same desperate stubbornness as the gray-green sagebrush that dotted the endless landscape. A few horses stood hitched to a rail, tails swishing lazily at flies. A dog with ribs showing watched her from the shade of the depot overhang, its tongue lolling. And then there were the people. They did not gather to greet the train so much as observe it from a distance. A woman in a faded calico dress paused with her basket, her face shadowed by a sunbonnet. Two men sitting on a bench in front of the general store stopped their whittling, their knives still. A blacksmith, his face grimed with soot, leaned in the massive doorway of his workshop, his muscular arms crossed. All their eyes were on her. Clara felt them like a physical weight, 100 tiny pinpricks on her skin. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the heat. She scanned the faces, searching for the one from the small, blurry photograph he had sent. A man with kind eyes and a square jaw, his expression serious but not unkind. Luke Garver. The name was a prayer she had whispered to herself for 1,000 miles. He was not there. Her heart gave a small, painful lurch, but she quieted it with reason. Perhaps he was delayed. A rancher's work was never done. A horse could have thrown a shoe, or a calf could have wandered off. He would come. He had to. His letter had promised it. She dragged her trunk to a bench under the depot's meager shade and sat down, smoothing the wrinkles from her gray wool skirt. She sat straight and proper, the way the matrons at the orphanage had taught her, as if posture alone could build a fortress against the world. The whispers started soon after. They drifted on the hot, restless wind, faint at first, then clearer as folks grew bolder. "Another one." The voice came from two women pretending to inspect fabric bolts outside the mercantile. "Looks pale. The sun'll eat her alive." Poor thing. Wonder what story she's running from. Same story they all run from. Left behind again. Mark my words. Garver won't show. The words stung like wind-whipped sand. Clara fixed her gaze on the horizon, on the hazy line where the brassy earth met the enormous sky. She would not let them see her flinch. She had endured worse than whispers. She had endured the cold silence of the orphanage, the thin blankets and thinner soup, the constant knowledge that she was an item on a ledger, a mouth to feed until she could be put to use. She had endured Mr. Albright. She could endure this. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning's relative cool. It beat on the tin roof of the depot, and the heat radiated down onto her. Her pale skin, so out of place in this sun-scorched land, began to prickle. The starched collar of her dress felt like a choker. An hour passed, then another. The station master, a thin man with a drooping mustache, came out, tipped his hat to her with a look of pity, and went back inside. The train gave a final, mournful whistle and began to chug its way eastward, leaving her utterly alone on the platform. The shadows of the buildings began to lengthen, stretching like long, skeletal fingers across the dusty road. Men started to drift toward the saloon, their spurs jingling a lonely tune. Their glances were different from the women's. They were heavier, more assessing. Clara felt a familiar, cold dread curl in her stomach. She knew that look. It was the look of men who saw a woman alone and saw not a person, but an opportunity, or a problem to be solved in a way that would only benefit them. The truth settled in her heart, not with a crash, but with a slow, sinking weight. He was not coming. Luke Garver was not coming. She was here, thousands of miles from the only life she had ever known, with $7 in her reticule and a trunk full of meager hopes. She was abandoned. Again, just as the sun began to bleed orange and purple across the horizon, casting the world in a bruised, beautiful light. A woman emerged from the building across the street labeled Dwyer's Inn and Eatery. She was of middle age, with tired lines etched around her eyes and a mouth set in a permanent look of weary resignation. She wiped her hands on her apron as she crossed the street, her movements slow and deliberate. "You still here, child?" the woman asked. Her voice was husky, roughened by dust and fatigue. Clara could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. The humiliation was a hot coal in her chest. The woman sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of every disappointment she had ever witnessed in this hard town. "I figured as much. The last train is long gone. Nobody else is coming for you tonight." She looked Clara up and down, taking in the neat but worn dress, the pale, strained face, and the single trunk. "You're the one for Luke Garver." It was not a question. Clara nodded again, blinking back the hot tears that threatened to fall. "My name is Martha Dwyer. I own the inn." She gestured with her head. "You cannot stay out here all night. It is not safe. Come on, I will give you a room." Gratitude and shame warred within Clara. I do not have much money, Mrs. Dwyer." "We will sort that out tomorrow," the innkeeper said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "For tonight, you will have a roof over your head. Get your trunk." Clara followed her across the street, her legs stiff from sitting so long. The inn was dim inside, smelling of stale beer, boiled meat, and lye soap. A few men sat at a table in the corner, eating stew and drinking. They stopped talking when Clara entered, their eyes following her as Mrs. Dwyer led her up a creaking staircase. "They are just looking," Mrs. Dwyer said without turning around. "Pay them no mind." But Clara heard one of them mutter to another, his voice a low rumble. "Another bought woman, left on the shelf." The other man chuckled. The words were meant to be overheard. They were meant to wound, to put her in her place. A bought woman, a piece of merchandise that the buyer had decided not to collect. The shame burned hotter, scorching her from the inside out. The room was small and spare. It contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single wooden chair. A small window looked out not onto the town, but onto the vast, empty plains behind it. Mrs. Dwyer set a flickering oil lamp on the stand. "The privy is out back," she said. "I will bring you up a plate of stew. You look like you could be knocked over by a strong breeze." "Thank you, Mrs. Dwyer," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "Do not thank me yet. Child, nothing in this world is free. We will talk in the morning." With that, she left, her footsteps heavy on the stairs. Alone, Clara sank onto the edge of the lumpy mattress. She walked to the window and looked out. The desert stretched into an endless, deepening twilight. There were no trees, no gentle hills, just the stark, flat expanse of the earth under an ocean of sky. In the distance, a dust devil, a miniature whirlwind, danced across the barren ground like a lonely ghost. It was the bleakest, most desolate landscape she had ever seen. It matched the landscape of her own heart. The past rose up to claim her, as it always did in moments of despair. She was a little girl again, standing before the severe headmistress of the St. Joseph's Home for Foundlings in Missouri. Her name was not her own. It had been given to her, just like the gray, scratchy uniform she wore. She learned early that to be wanted was the greatest gift in the world, and it was a gift she had never been given. She learned to be quiet, to be helpful, to make herself as small as possible, hoping someone might see a useful girl, if not a lovable one. No one ever did. When she came of age, they found her a position as a seamstress for a wealthy family. It was there she met Mr. Albright, the family's handsome nephew. He had spoken to her of love, of a life away from servitude. He had whispered promises in the dark and painted pictures of a future she had never dared to dream of. She, a girl from an orphanage, was to be a wife. She had believed him. She had given him her heart, and in a moment of weakness and desperate longing, she had given him more. The engagement was broken a month later. He had tired of his game. His aunt dismissed her without a reference, her eyes cold with contempt. "You should have known your place," she had said. Clara was left with nothing but a shattered heart and a reputation in tatters. No decent family would hire her now. She was damaged goods. It was in a boarding house, down to her last few dollars, that she saw the advertisement in a copy of the Matrimonial Monitor. A rancher in a place called Red Hollow sought a wife, a woman of good character, willing to work hard and build a life in the West. He was a widower with a small child. He promised a home, companionship, and respect. Desperation was a powerful motivator. It pushed aside pride and fear. She wrote to him, telling a version of her story that was true enough. She wrote of her lonely childhood, her skill in keeping a house, her desire for a family. She omitted the part about Mr. Albright. She omitted the shame. To her astonishment, he wrote back. His name was Luke Garver. His handwriting was surprisingly neat, the letters strong and clear. His words were simple, direct, and kind. He did not write of romance or passion, but of shared work and quiet evenings. He wrote of his little girl, Emma, and his hope that a woman's presence might bring light back into their home. He sent the train fare and a photograph, looking at his steady, honest face. Clara had allowed herself to feel a fragile tendril of hope. Maybe this time, someone would want her. Now, in this small, lonely room, that hope felt like a cruel joke. She pulled his letter from her pocket. The paper was soft and worn from being read and reread 100 times. "Miss Hastings," it began, "your letter was a comfort. It sounds as if you are a woman of fortitude. This is a hard land, and it requires a strong spirit. I cannot offer you riches, but I can offer you a home. I can offer you my name and my protection. My daughter, Emma, needs a mother. Our house is quiet, too quiet. If you are willing to come, I will meet your train. We can build a good life together. Respectfully, Luke Garver." She traced his name with her finger. The kind words, the promise of a home, of a family. It all dissolved into the bitter reality of her situation. He had not come. All his respectable words meant nothing. Sleep did not come easy. Every creak of the inn, every distant shout from the saloon, reminded her of how alone she was. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gray, it brought no comfort, only the stark light of a new day and a decision that had to be made. She could take the next train east, but to what? To starvation? To a life of shame and poverty in a city that had already cast her out? Or she could stay here, in this unforgiving town, and try to survive. She washed her face in the cold water from the pitcher and braided her long brown hair. She put on her only other dress, a simple brown cotton, and went downstairs. Mrs. Dwyer was already there, kneading a massive ball of dough on a floured countertop. "Morning," the innkeeper grunted, not looking up. Clara's hands trembled, but she forced her voice to be steady. "Mrs. Dwyer, I wanted to ask, do you know Mr. Garver? Mrs. Dwyer stopped kneading. She sighed and wiped a stray strand of gray hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of flour. I know him. Everybody here knows him. Do you know why he was not at the depot? The older woman looked at her then, her gaze sharp but not unkind. Child, Luke Garver has not set foot in this town unless he absolutely has to, not since his wife, Sarah, died. It has been 2 years now. His wife? Clara's heart sank even further. The letter had said he was a widower. Died giving birth to Emma. Mrs. Dwyer supplied, her voice softening a little. There was a fire in the barn that same night. A terrible, terrible night. He lost half his stock and his wife all at once. Something in him broke that night. He just closed himself off. Lives out there on that ranch of his with the little one and barely speaks a word to anyone. A heavy silence filled the kitchen. Clara tried to absorb it all. The man who had written those kind, steady words was a ghost, haunted by a past he could not escape. But the letter, Clara faltered. He sent for me. I heard talk his friend, Jed, put the ad in the paper for him. Mrs. Dwyer said gently. Jed meant well. He thought Luke needed a wife, that the girl needed a mother. Maybe he even wrote the letters. I reckon Luke never even knew you were coming. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and with it, the last of Clara's hope shattered. She had not been rejected by a man she had never met. She had been summoned by a ghost, the product of a well-meaning deception. She had built her entire future on a foundation of sand, and now it had all washed away. Tears she had refused to shed on the platform now burned behind her eyes. She fought them back fiercely. She would not cry. She would not. What will you do now? Mrs. Dwyer asked, her eyes searching Clara's face. I do not know, Clara whispered honestly. She looked at her own hands, soft and pale. They were not the hands of a woman used to hard labor, but they were all she had. Is there work? Anything? I can pay for my room. I need to earn fare for a ticket. To go somewhere else. Mrs. Dwyer studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I can always use another pair of hands. The floors need scrubbing. Linens need washing. It is hard work, and the pay is not much more than room and board. I will do it, Clara said, a desperate resolve hardening in her voice. I will do any work you have. And so, Clara Hastings, the mail-order bride who was not a bride, became a drudge at Dwyer's Inn. She scrubbed the floors until her knees were raw and her back ached. She washed sheets in a tub of scalding, lye-heavy water until her hands were red and chapped. She served meals to dusty, weary travelers and saloon regulars, ignoring their stares and their crude, whispered comments. She worked from before sunup to long after sundown, fueled by a grim determination to survive. Each coin she earned was a small step away from Red Hollow, a tiny piece of a future she would have to build for herself, by herself. Days blurred into a routine of sweat and exhaustion. She learned the rhythms of the town, the quiet mornings, the rowdy evenings, the tense silence of a Sunday afternoon. She learned the faces of the people, the women who looked at her with pity or scorn, the men who looked at her with hunger. She kept to herself, speaking only when necessary, building a wall of quiet dignity around her broken heart. It was one afternoon, nearly a week after her arrival, that everything changed. The inn was quiet, the midday meal was over, and the lull of late afternoon had settled over the town. Clara was polishing glasses behind the counter, her movements mechanical, her thoughts 1,000 miles away. The front door creaked open, letting in a shaft of bright, dusty sunlight. A small figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. It was a little girl, no older than 5 or 6. Her dress was a shapeless, dirt-smudged sack, and her bare feet were coated in red dust. Her hair was the color of straw, tangled and unkempt, and her face was a mask of grime. Except for 2 very large, very solemn blue eyes. In one hand, she clutched a doll made of rags, its button eyes staring blankly. The little girl stood there for a long moment, simply watching Clara. She did not seem shy or afraid, just observant, as if Clara were a curious creature she had never seen before. Clara stopped her polishing and looked back, a strange stillness coming over her. There was an old soul's sorrow in the child's eyes. Slowly, the girl padded across the wooden floor, her small, dirty feet making no sound. She stopped directly in front of Clara, so close that Clara could have reached out and touched her hair. She tilted her head back and stared up into Clara's face. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, in a voice that was little more than a breath, a tiny, clear whisper that cut through all the noise in Clara's head, the little girl asked, "Can you be my mommy?" The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. They were tender and bewildering and so achingly innocent that they felt almost holy in the quiet afternoon. All the air went out of her lungs. Her heart, which she thought had been hammered into a hard, unfeeling stone, suddenly cracked wide open. She could not speak, could not move. She could only stare into those impossibly blue, searching eyes. A sharp gasp came from the kitchen doorway. "Mrs." Dwyer stood there, a wet dishcloth in her hand, her face pale with shock. "Merciful heavens," the innkeeper breathed. "That is Luke Garver's little girl. That's Emma." As if summoned by the name, a shadow fell across the front door. Clara's gaze was pulled from the child's face to the entrance. A man stood there, just outside, near the hitching post. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but he seemed stooped, as if carrying an immense weight. He was covered in the same red dust as his daughter, his clothes worn and faded. He did not move, did not speak. He simply stood there, staring at them, at his daughter, and at her. The woman his daughter had just claimed, with the most haunted, broken eyes Clara had ever seen. The tall man moved from the stark sunlight of the doorway into the inn's gloom, and the air in the room grew heavy and tight. Luke Garver was built of the land itself, all long limbs, broad shoulders, and a hardness that seemed baked into his very bones by the relentless sun. His face was a landscape of its own, weathered and creased, with a dark stubble clinging to a jaw set as tight as a locked gate. But it was his eyes that held the true story. They were the color of a stormy sky, shadowed with a grief so profound it seemed to have hollowed him out from the inside. He did not look at Clara. His gaze went straight to the small girl, and a muscle worked in his jaw. He moved slowly, awkwardly, as if his own body were an unfamiliar burden. "Emma," he said, and his voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. It was a voice that had forgotten how to speak of anything soft. The little girl? Emma did not let go of Clara's skirt. She pressed her face against the rough brown cotton, hiding from the man who was her father. Luke stopped a few feet away, his large, calloused hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He finally lifted his eyes to Clara, but they did not meet hers. Instead, they fixed on a point just over her shoulder, as if looking her directly in the face was a transgression he could not commit. "Ma'am," he began, the word clumsy on his tongue. "I apologize. For this, she wanders sometimes. I am sorry for the intrusion." Clara found her voice, though it was thin and unsteady. "It is no intrusion." He seemed not to hear her. A dark flush crept up his neck, the color of shame. "And I am sorry for the other thing. For you being here, I did not. It was my friend, Jed. He thought he was helping. He had no right. I never meant for you to come all this way for nothing. I would have sent word if I'd known." Each word was a hammer blow to Clara's already fractured pride. It was true. Then, all of it. She was not just unwanted. She was an accident, a mistake, a piece of misplaced mail delivered to the wrong address. The humiliation she had held at bay for a week now rose like bile in her throat, hot and suffocating. She felt the blood drain from her face, and for a moment, the room tilted. He reached down and gently tried to pry Emma's fingers from Clara's skirt. "Come on now, little bird. It is time to go home." Emma resisted, her small body tense. She let out a tiny, whimpering sound, but his hand was firm, and with a final, lingering touch of her small fingers against the fabric. She was separated from Clara. Luke took her hand, his own engulfing it completely. As he turned to leave, Emma looked back at Clara, her blue eyes wide and filled with a silent, desperate plea. Then they were gone, leaving behind only the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the open door and a silence that was more profound than the one before. That night, sleep was impossible. Clara lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the inn. The low murmur of conversation from the eatery below drifted up through the floorboards, and she could piece together more of the story that had so thoroughly wrecked her own. A tragic business, the Garvers. A man's voice, a traveling salesman by the sound of him, said, "I was through here right after it happened. Whole town was in a state." "He blames himself," another voice replied, one she recognized as a local ranch hand. Sarah was in labor, see, and a storm was kicking up something fierce. Lightning struck the barn. He ran out to save the stock, but the fire moved fast. By the time he got back to the house, the baby was born. And Sarah, she was gone, bled out. He has carried that choice with him every day since. The horses or the wife. "That is a heavy load for any man," the salesman said quietly. "Broke him," the ranch hand confirmed. "Broke him and the little girl. She has not said a word since that night, not a single one. It is like the fire burned the voice right out of her." Clara pressed her face into her thin pillow. So Emma's whispered question was not just her first word to Clara. It was one of the first she had spoken in 2 years. The thought was a strange mix of wonder and pain. A child starved for a mother had picked her, the most motherless soul in all of Red Hollow. The next afternoon, the town sheriff paid a visit. He was a portly man named Sheriff Miller, with a kind face but weary eyes that had seen too much trouble. He found Clara shaking a dusty rug in the alley behind the inn. He cleared his throat. "Miss Hastings, a word, if you please." Clara stopped, clutching the rug to her chest like a shield. "I do not mean to alarm you," he said, removing his hat and wiping his brow. "But this is not a good place for a woman on her own. You have made your situation known to Mrs. Dwyer, and I commend you for your industry. But folks are talking, and the men who drink their pay at the saloon, their talk gets ugly." He looked uncomfortable. "They make crude jokes about mail-order brides who do not get claimed. A woman alone is seen as either a target or an opportunity. Neither is a good thing to be." His warning, though kindly meant, was another brand of shame on her skin. She was a problem, a temptation, a piece of stray livestock that needed to be moved along before it caused a stampede. "I am saving for my passage. Sheriff," she said, her voice tight, "I will be gone as soon as I am able." "See that you are," he said, nodding. He put his hat back on. "It is for the best." His words settled it. She could not stay. She was a blight on this town, a source of gossip and indecent speculation. The West, which was supposed to be a place of new beginnings, had no room for a woman like her. That night, she counted her meager earnings. It was not enough, not nearly enough, but she would make it work. She would buy a ticket for the next train, no matter where it was going. Anywhere was better than here. She rose before dawn, a firm resolve in her heart. She would tell Mrs. Dwyer, work one last day, and then she would be free. She took the water buckets out to the well behind the inn, the air cool and clean against her face, and she saw her. Emma was sitting on the edge of the stone well, her small legs dangling. The rag doll held tight in her lap. She was not looking at Clara, but at the rising sun. her small, dirty face bathed in the soft morning light. She looked impossibly small and alone. Clara's heart did a painful flip. "Emma, what are you doing here? Does your father know where you are?" The little girl did not answer. She simply slid off the well, and when Clara picked up her buckets to go back inside, she followed. She kept a careful distance of 3 paces, her bare feet making no sound in the dust. When Clara went into the kitchen, Emma stood in the doorway. When Clara swept the floor, Emma sat on the bottom step of the stairs, watching. Her silence was a living thing, a presence that was both unnerving and deeply sorrowful. Mrs. Dwyer came down and saw the child. She just shook her head. "Happened before. She just appears, looking for something, I suppose." She looked at Clara. "You heard what they said, about her not speaking. For 2 years, not a sound. And then she speaks to you." The weight of those words, of that one whispered question, settled on Clara again. How could she leave now? How could she turn her back on the one child in the world who had looked at her and seen not a stranger, not a fallen woman, not a problem, but a mother? Her resolve to leave crumbled. "I had best take her home," Clara said, her voice heavy with a resignation that felt like fate. The walk to the Garver Ranch was over 2 miles. Emma trotted along beside her, occasionally putting her small, dusty hand into Clara's. The land grew harsher the farther they went from town. The sagebrush was thicker, the ground more rocky. Finally, she saw it in the distance. It was less a ranch than a collection of weary buildings surrendering to the vast, indifferent landscape. The house was a simple structure of sun-bleached timber, its porch sagging on one side. The fences that should have contained a herd of cattle were broken in a dozen places, the wire coiling into the dust like dead snakes. The cattle she could see were thin, their ribs showing. A large, dark scar on the earth showed where the barn had once stood. All that remained was a heap of charred timbers and a stone foundation, a tombstone for a past that refused to stay buried. Luke Garver was trying to reset a fence post, his back to her. He worked with a frantic, punishing energy, his muscles straining against his worn shirt. He moved as if he were at war with the land, with the fence, with himself. He did not hear them approach over the whisper of the wind. It was Emma who announced their presence, running the last few yards and wrapping her arms around his leg. He straightened up slowly, his body stiff. He looked from Emma to Clara, and his face was a mask of exhaustion and something else, a deep, painful shame that she was seeing him like this, seeing the ruin he lived in. "I found her at the well," Clara said simply. He just nodded, his eyes avoiding hers. "I am obliged to you." He knelt and spoke to Emma in his rough voice. "You cannot keep doing this, little bird. You are scaring your papa half to death." Emma just buried her face in his shoulder. Clara should have left then. She should have turned and walked back to the relative safety of the inn. But she could not. She looked at the sagging porch, at the thin cattle, at this broken man and his silent child. And she felt a pull she could not explain. It was not pity. It was something deeper, a recognition of a loneliness that mirrored her own. So it began. Every few days, Emma would appear in town, a silent little shadow, and Clara would walk her home. Each time, she saw more of the neglect, the decay. Each time, she saw Luke Garver fighting his losing battle against the encroaching wilderness. He worked with a fury that was a form of prayer, a way to keep the ghosts at bay. His hands were a geography of scars, cuts, and calluses. He rarely spoke to her beyond a muttered, "Obliged to you." Her pride screamed at her to stop. She was not his responsibility. This was not her life. But her heart, a thing she had long thought useless, told her to stay. One day, after returning Emma, she saw a pile of his work shirts, ripped and caked with mud. Before she could think about it, she picked them up. "I can mend these," she said. He stopped his work, turning to look at her. truly look at her. For the first time, suspicion warred with weariness in his eyes. "You do not have to do that." "I know," she said, "but my hands are idle otherwise." He argued no more. He just watched her walk back toward town with his mending in her arms. The next time she brought Emma home, she also brought a small pot of beef stew from the inn's kitchen. She set it on his table without a word. He protested, his voice low and strained. "Ma'am, I cannot pay you for this." "I am not asking for pay," she said, her chin held high. "A person has to eat." He fell silent. When she left, she saw him through the window, sitting at the table, eating the stew as if he had not had a proper meal in years. So it went on, small invasions of grace into his world of grief, a mended shirt, a loaf of fresh bread, a clean floor. He protested less and less, accepting her help with a quiet, bewildered resignation. She learned the landscape of his house, the single photograph of a smiling, beautiful woman on the mantelpiece, the small, neatly kept corner where Emma's few toys were, the overwhelming sense of emptiness that clung to the air like dust. They rarely spoke, but a strange, fragile rhythm developed between them. They were two wounded animals circling each other, unsure whether to trust or to flee. And in the middle was Emma, the silent, beating heart of their broken world. Then the storm came. It rolled in from the west one afternoon, a bruised purple and black cloud that swallowed the sky. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the little house, and the rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. Clara had brought Emma home just before the first drops fell and had been stranded there. Luke had stood awkwardly in the main room. "You had best wait it out. It is not safe to be on the road." So she stayed. They ate a cold meal of bread and jerky in the flickering lamplight as the storm raged outside. Emma was quiet, her eyes wide with fear at the sound of the thunder that shook the very foundations of the house. As the evening wore on, she grew listless, her small face flushed. By nightfall, she was burning with fever. Clara felt the child's forehead. It was terrifyingly hot. Emma's breathing was shallow, and she shivered uncontrollably despite the heavy quilt Clara wrapped her in. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Luke. He paced the small room like a caged animal, his helplessness a palpable force. "The doctor is in Red Hollow," he muttered, staring out at the raging storm. "I will never make it through this mud." "We will have to tend to her here," Clara said, her voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the terror she felt inside. She took charge, the years of rote servitude in the orphanage and the sewing room suddenly transforming into a quiet competence. "Get me cold water from the rain barrel, and clean rags." He moved to obey, his frantic energy now focused by her calm command. The night became a long, desperate battle. Clara sat by Emma's small bed, bathing her face and wrists with cool water, forcing small sips of water between her cracked lips. The little girl tossed and turned, crying out in her delirium, her small hands clutching at the air. Luke stood by the fireplace, a helpless giant, his face etched with a fear that was raw and terrifying to behold. He was reliving another night, another storm, another bedside vigil that had ended in tragedy. Clara could see it in his eyes. To soothe the child, Clara began to hum. Then, hesitantly, she began to sing. They were old songs, lullabies she barely remembered hearing as a small child, songs that must have been passed down from a mother she never knew. Her voice was soft and untrained, but it was steady in the roaring dark. She sang of meadows and starlight and a love that kept you safe through the night. Sometime after midnight, Emma's shivering subsided. She fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, her breathing evening out. Clara did not move. She stayed in the chair, her hand resting on the child's chest, feeling the small, steady rise and fall. She must have dozed off, her head slumped against the back of the chair. She woke to a world of pale, gray light. The storm had passed, The only sound was the drip of water from the eaves. She was stiff and cold, but a small warmth was pressed against her. Emma had rolled over in her sleep and was now nestled against Clara's side, her small fingers tightly clutching a fold of Clara's dress. Her face, peaceful in sleep, was turned toward Clara's arm. A floorboard creaked. Clara looked up. Luke was standing in the doorway, watching them. The fire had died down, and the morning light cast long shadows across the room. He looked as if he had not slept at all. His face was gray with exhaustion, but the raw panic was gone from his eyes. In its place was something else, something complex and unreadable. He watched them for a long time, his gaze on his daughter sleeping peacefully in the arms of this stranger who had appeared like a ghost and refused to leave. He saw the trust in his daughter's hand, the way she had turned to Clara for comfort in the depths of her fevered nightmare. Something deep inside him, a place that had been frozen solid for 2 years, shifted with a painful, grinding crack. It was gratitude, sharp and overwhelming. And tangled up in it was another feeling, a flicker of longing he refused to name, a feeling he had no right to. He cleared his throat, and the sound was loud in the quiet room. Clara gently extricated herself from Emma's grasp, careful not to wake her. She stood up, her body aching with fatigue. Luke finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "The fever has broken. I thank you."
"She is a strong little girl,"
Clara said softly. He looked at Clara then, his gaze direct for a moment before skittering away. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the paleness of her face. He saw the woman who had mended his clothes, fed his child, and faced down a fever in a storm. And he felt a sudden, sharp stab of fear, not for himself, but for her. "You should not stay," he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. He softened his tone. "Folks talk. They will see you were here all night. They will say things." Clara looked at him, at this man so terrified of the world's judgment, so trapped in his own grief. The pain of his words was a dull ache, familiar and constant. She had been judged her whole life, for being an orphan, for being foolish in love, for being alone. His warning was nothing new. She met his gaze, her own eyes quiet and filled with a sorrow that matched his.
"They always talk,"
she said. Clara did not leave. The morning after the storm, she made a quiet proposal, her words aimed at the floorboards rather than at Luke Garver's tense, guarded face. She would stay on. She said not at the inn, but here. She would cook and clean, mend and manage the house. She would care for Emma. In return, she asked only for a roof over her head and simple board. She presented it as a business arrangement, a temporary stop on her journey west, a way to earn her keep until she had saved enough to move on. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But it was a lie that provided a necessary fiction, a flimsy wall of propriety to hide behind. Luke's first instinct was to refuse. To have her here, under his roof, was a danger he could not properly name. It was a violation of the sterile, silent world of grief he had built around himself. It was a complication. It was a temptation. But then he looked at Emma, who was sitting at the table quietly eating a piece of bread, her eyes following Clara's every move. He looked at the clean floor, at the pot of coffee simmering on the stove, at the neatly folded rags by the wash basin. He felt the echo of the long, terrifying night, and he remembered the calm sound of Clara's voice singing in the dark. He was so tired. Tired of the silence, tired of the dirt, tired of the crushing weight of doing it all alone. "All right," he agreed, the word tasting like a surrender. He insisted on paying her a small wage, $1 a week, to make it official. He needed that formality, the pretense that she was just hired help, that this was a transaction and not something far more complicated. So a new life began, a quiet, fragile thing that took root in the cracked earth of the Garver Ranch. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. Clara rose before dawn, lighting the stove and setting the coffee to boil. She learned the quirks of the old iron cook stove, the way to coax bread to rise in the dry air, how to make a nourishing meal out of little more than beans and salt pork. She scrubbed the floors, beat the dust from the rugs, and washed their clothes in a large wooden tub, her hands growing rough and chapped. She brought a sense of order to the chaos, a quiet cleanliness that began to push back against the years of neglect. Luke worked the ranch with the same relentless fury, but something had subtly changed. Before, his work had been a penance, a way to punish his body to quiet his mind. Now, there was a purpose to it. He started mending the fences in earnest, his hammer blows ringing out in the morning air. He rode out to round up his stray cattle, his herd thin but not yet lost. In the evenings, he no longer sat staring into the fire, a ghost in his own home. He would sit at the table, cleaning his rifle or mending a piece of tack, while Clara sewed by the light of the lamp. They rarely spoke, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with her presence, a low, steady hum of calm that soothed the ragged edges of his soul. He found himself depending on it, on the simple comfort of not being entirely alone when the sun went down. But while a fragile peace settled over the ranch, the town of Red Hollow seethed with speculation. Their arrangement was a scandal, a morsel of gossip too juicy to ignore. Clara felt the change whenever she rode into town for supplies. The whispers were no longer just curious. They were cruel, edged with a self-righteous venom. One afternoon in the general store, as she was waiting for Mr. Henderson to weigh out a sack of flour, she felt the eyes of two women on her back. They were the wives of prominent ranchers, women who considered themselves the moral arbiters of the town. Their voices were low, but they carried in the quiet store. "Living out there, in his house. It is a disgrace." One of them, Mrs. Bishop, hissed. "What else can you expect?" The other, Mrs. Gable, replied, her voice dripping with disdain. "She came here to be bought. When the sale fell through, she found another way to offer her wares." Clara's back went rigid. She squeezed her reticule so tightly her knuckles ached. "Mrs. Bishop then said the word, spitting it out like something foul. "Harlot." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. "Mr." Henderson fumbled with the flour sack, his face turning red. Clara felt every eye in the store on her. She wanted to run, to disappear, but she was trapped by the weight of their judgment. She paid for her flour, her hands trembling, and walked out of the store with her head held as high as she could manage, the women's smug laughter following her out the door. She did not tell Luke about it. It was her shame to bear, not his, but the ugliness of the town could not be kept at bay forever. A few days later, Luke rode into town to buy a new axe handle. Clara had come with him to deliver some mended shirts to the blacksmith. As they were tying up their horses in front of the saloon, a group of ranch hands stumbled out, their faces flushed with whiskey. One of them, a big slovenly man named Cole, recognized Luke. "Well, look here," Cole sneered, his eyes landing on Clara with a leering insolence. "It is the hermit Garver. Heard you finally got yourself some company out there. Did not even have to pay full price for this one. Did you? Got yourself some damaged goods for cheap." Luke went still. The air crackled. "You watch your mouth, Cole," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Cole laughed, emboldened by the whiskey and his audience of friends. "Why? Am I saying something that is not true? Everyone knows what she is. She is nothing but a saloon girl without the saloon." Before Clara could even process the insult, Luke moved. It was not a conscious decision. It was a pure, violent reflex. He lunged at Cole, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. Cole staggered back, and his friends, whooping and hollering, jumped into the fray. It was a brutal, clumsy brawl, all flailing fists and grunts of pain. Luke fought with a cold, silent fury, but he was outnumbered. They drove him back against a water trough. landing blows to his face and ribs. The town sheriff finally broke it up, firing his pistol into the air. Cole and his friends staggered away. Muttering curses, Luke was left leaning against the trough, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His lip was split and bleeding, and a dark bruise was already forming under his left eye. He did not say a word. He just pushed himself upright, grabbed the reins of his horse, and started the long, silent ride back to the ranch. That night, after Emma was asleep, Clara brought a bowl of warm water and a cloth to the main room where Luke sat staring into the fire. The oil lamp cast flickering shadows across the floor, making the small room feel both intimate and immense. The air was heavy with the scent of whiskey on his breath, the sweat of the fight, and the unspoken thing that now lay raw and exposed between them. She knelt in front of him and gently began to clean the cut on his lip. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. His face was a mess of cuts and bruises, a testament to a battle fought for her honor. A wave of guilt and a fierce, protective tenderness washed over her.
You should not have done that,
she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He kept his eyes on the fire. A man cannot let another man say things like that about a woman in his care. She finished cleaning the cut and dipped the cloth back into the water. As she reached up to wipe a smear of blood from his cheekbone, his hand shot up and caught her wrist. His grip was not rough, but it was firm, stopping her movement. His calloused fingers were a shock of warmth against her skin. He finally looked at her, and the defenses in his eyes, the walls he had so carefully built, crumbled. For a moment, she saw the man underneath the grief, a man starved for comfort, drowning in a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache. "No one," he said, his voice hoarse with a pain that had nothing to do with his bruises. "No one has touched me with kindness in 2 years." The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. The world shrank to the small circle of lamplight, to the space of a few inches that separated their faces. He was still holding her wrist, his thumb stroking the delicate skin on the inside of her arm. He leaned forward, his eyes searching hers, and she leaned in to meet him. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment the silence broke, the moment the space between them finally closed. Their lips were a breath away from touching when he froze. A shadow passed over his face, a look of anguish and fear. He pulled back as if he had been burned, releasing her wrist.
"I cannot,"
he whispered, the words ragged and torn from him. He stood up abruptly and walked out onto the porch, leaving her kneeling by the fire, alone in the sudden, crushing silence. Clara did not follow him. She stayed where she was, the tears she refused to shed burning behind her eyes. She had been a fool to hope. He was a man shackled to a ghost, and there was no room in his heart for her. She continued her work, her movements becoming more mechanical, her smiles for Emma a little more brittle. Her heart ached with a constant, dull pain every time she saw him. He was more distant than ever, the moment of vulnerability having spooked him back behind his walls. He worked harder, stayed out longer, and spoke even less. They were two ghosts now, haunting the same house. And then Emma began to talk. It started as whispers, single words uttered only when she and Clara were alone. "Water, doll, sun." Each word was a precious gift, a tiny miracle. Clara did not push her, just accepted them with a quiet joy, talking to the child constantly, filling the silence Emma had lived in for so long. One afternoon, they were in the small vegetable patch Clara had started, pulling weeds from around the struggling tomato plants. Emma pointed to a butterfly that had landed on a leaf. "Pretty," Emma said, her voice clear. "Yes, it is very pretty," Clara said, smiling. Emma then looked up at Clara, her blue eyes serious and full of a simple, profound truth. She reached out and touched Clara's cheek with her small, dirt-smudged hand. "Mama," she said. The word was clear, perfect and utterly devastating. It was not a question this time, but a statement, a fact, in the child's mind. That is who Clara was. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She felt a joy so sharp it was painful, followed by a wave of sorrow. She was not her mama. She was nothing. And then she saw him. Luke was standing by the corner of the house, a coil of rope in his hand. He had been on his way to the corral. He was frozen in place, his face ashen. He had heard. He stared at them, at his daughter, who had not spoken his name in 2 years, bestowing the most sacred of names upon a stranger. Clara could see the war in his eyes. There was joy, a brilliant, unmistakable flash of it, that his daughter was truly speaking again. But it was followed swiftly by a deep, wrenching sorrow. The word was a betrayal of his dead wife, a ghost he still loved. And it was a confirmation of what Clara had become to them, a reality he could not face. Without a word, he turned and walked away. His shoulders slumped as if under a crushing new weight. The town's simmering hostility was brought to a boil by the arrival of the Reverend Josiah Brand. He was a traveling preacher, a man with a booming voice and eyes that burned with a righteous fire. He set up a tent at the edge of town and began to hold nightly sermons. His subject was sin. He railed against the evils of liquor, gambling, and corruption, and his favorite target was the perceived decay of moral fiber on the frontier, particularly among its women. He preached of Jezebels and sunbonnets, and condemned the practice of mail-order brides as a marketplace for flesh, a corruption of the sacred institution of marriage. His sermons were fire and brimstone, and the people of Red Hollow, starved for diversion and eager to have their own virtues affirmed, flocked to hear him. He stirred up their prejudices, gave their gossip the weight of divine authority, and fanned the flames of their resentment toward the woman at the Garver Ranch. The culmination came one hot, dusty afternoon. Clara was hanging laundry on the line when she saw them coming, a small delegation of women marching up the road to the ranch. She recognized Mrs. Bishop and Mrs. Gable in the lead, their face set in grim, determined lines. There were 5 of them in total, a small army of righteousness. Luke was in the corral, breaking a young horse. He saw them too and vaulted over the fence, his face dark with anger. He met them in the yard, placing himself between them and the house, between them and Clara. "What do you want, Mrs. Bishop?" he asked, his voice flat and hard. "We have come to speak with you, Mr. Garver," she said, her voice shrill. About her." She gestured toward Clara with a contemptuous flick of her wrist. "It is a shameful situation. She is a disgrace to every decent, God-fearing wife in this town. The Reverend Brand himself spoke of such arrangements as an abomination." "What goes on at my ranch is my business," Luke said, his hands clenching into fists. "It is the town's business when it brings shame upon us all." Mrs. Gable chimed in. "You must send her away, for the sake of your daughter. If not for your own reputation, we demand that she leave Red Hollow." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She stood frozen by the clothesline, the wet sheet clutched in her hand. This was it. He would have to choose. He would send her away. Of course he would. He could not stand against the whole town. Luke stood silent for a long moment, the wind whipping dust around their feet. He looked at the hard, unforgiving faces of the women. Then he looked over his shoulder at Clara, standing small and defiant by the flapping laundry. He looked at the house, which no longer felt like a tomb. He thought of Emma's clear voice saying a word he had longed to hear. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind with a clarity and a passion that stunned them all. "No," he said. He took a step forward. "You will not come onto my land and tell me how to live. You talk about shame. The only shame I see is in your own hearts, in the pleasure you take in judging a woman you know nothing about. This woman," he said, and he finally looked directly at Clara. his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light, "has brought more decency and kindness to this house than this entire town has shown me in 2 years. She is the only good thing that has happened to this place. Now get off my land." The women were shocked into silence. They stared at him, then at Clara, their mouths agape, defeated by the force of his conviction. They turned and began the long, silent march back to town. Clara stood, trembling, as Luke watched them go. When they were out of sight, the rigid strength seemed to drain out of him. He walked over to the porch and sank onto the steps, burying his face in his hands. His broad shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. She went to him, her heart aching for him, for them. She sat down beside him, not touching him, just being there. After a long time, he lifted his head. His face was a mask of anguish. "They are right," he whispered, his voice broken. "My keeping you here, my feelings, they will ruin you. I will ruin you." The word hung in the air between them. Ruin. It was the word that had haunted her entire life. She was already ruined in the eyes of the world. But here, in this broken man's despair, she saw not ruin, but a desperate, lonely love. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the force of the truth she was about to speak. She looked at him, her own eyes filling with tears. "Maybe," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet filled with a strength she did not know she possessed. "Maybe ruin is better than loneliness." Clara's words, spoken in the trembling quiet of that afternoon, changed everything and nothing. They hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of grief and fear. But a bridge is not a home, and their declaration was no shield against the harsh realities of the land. The sun, which had witnessed their silent stand against the town, grew hotter and more merciless. The sky, a vast and indifferent blue, refused to weep. The season of rain passed, and no rain came. Drought settled over the plains like a sickness. The earth grew a cracked, feverish skin. The creek that ran through Luke's property shrank to a muddy trickle and then vanished altogether, leaving a dry, stony wound in the land. The grass turned from green to gold to a brittle, lifeless brown. The well near the house, which had always been reliable, began to offer up more mud than water with each turn of the crank. The ranch, already struggling, began to die. The cattle, their ribs stark beneath their hides, stood listlessly in the punishing sun, their mournful lowing a constant, weary complaint. One morning, Luke found 2 of his best cows dead by the dry creek bed. After that, he began to ride out farther and farther each day, a desperate pilgrim in search of a spring, a hidden water hole, anything to keep his herd alive. He would leave before dawn, his face a grim mask, and return long after dark, his shoulders slumped with the weight of another failed day. His absence left Clara in charge of a crumbling kingdom. The burden of survival fell squarely upon her. She became a creature of endless, back-breaking labor. She hauled buckets of precious, murky water from the failing well, rationing every drop for drinking, for cooking, for the parched plants in her small garden. She patched the holes in the roof with tar and scavenged bits of tin, her hands growing calloused and strong. She learned to shoot Luke's old rifle, hunting jackrabbits and prairie hens to keep meat on the table, her stomach churning the first few times she had to skin her kill. She kept Emma fed, kept the house from being swallowed by dust, and kept a flame of hope alive in a world that seemed determined to extinguish it. Her clothes grew worn and tattered, her skin burned by the sun and scratched by the wind. She was no longer the pale, soft woman who had stepped off the train. The West was scouring her down to the bone, and it was discovering that the bone was made of steel. But in the midst of this grinding hardship, something beautiful and unexpected began to bloom. The walls between her and Luke, already cracked, began to crumble into dust. The shared struggle forged a new kind of intimacy between them, one built not on whispered promises but on the solid foundation of mutual reliance. Tenderness arrived in small, stolen moments. It was in the shared cup of coffee at dawn, their hands brushing as he took it from her before his long ride. It was in the way he would sometimes return with a handful of stubborn wildflowers he had found clinging to life in a rocky crevice, laying them on the table without a word. It was in the rare, unrestrained sound of laughter that filled the small house one afternoon when Emma, her voice now a cheerful, constant chatter, chased a yellow butterfly through a patch of weeds, her small legs pumping as she ran in joyful circles. Clara saw Luke watching from the corral, and for the first time, he was not just smiling, he was truly laughing. A deep, rusty sound that was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. One evening, he decided she needed to learn to ride properly. He had an old, gentle mare named Daisy that was perfect for her. He led her out into the corral as the sun was setting, the world bathed in a soft, golden light. "You cannot live out here and not know how to sit a horse," he said, his tone practical, but his eyes were soft. His hands were on hers as he showed her how to hold the reins. He stood beside her, his arm brushing against her back as he adjusted her posture in the saddle. His touch was electric, a jolt of warmth and life that shot through her. The scent of him, leather, dust, and honest sweat, filled her senses. "Just feel the horse," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. "Move with her. Do not fight her." He led the mare around the corral, his hand resting on the bridle, his presence a steady, reassuring anchor. In that hour, as the sky turned from gold to a bruised purple, they were not a broken rancher and a disgraced mail-order bride. They were just a man and a woman, standing close together in the fading light. The world and all its troubles held at bay just outside the circle of the corral fence. The respite, like all things in that hard land, was temporary. The end came with the scent of smoke on the night air. It was a moonless, starless night, the kind of oppressive dark that feels like a heavy blanket. A hot, dry wind had been blowing all day, rattling the windows and kicking up dust. Clara was woken from a light sleep by the smell first, acrid and sharp. Then she heard it, a low, distant roar, like a freight train where no tracks existed. She threw on her dress and ran to the window. The entire western horizon was glowing with a malevolent orange light. A prairie fire, and the wind was driving it straight toward them. "Luke!" she screamed, her voice tight with panic. "Luke, wake up!" He was out of his room in an instant, his eyes wide with the same terror she felt. "Get Emma," he commanded, his voice sharp and clear, all weariness gone, replaced by the instinct of a man used to crisis. While she rushed to scoop the sleepy, whimpering child from her bed, Luke was already in action. He filled every bucket they owned with the last of the well water. They dragged wet blankets and horse cloths from the house, their lungs already beginning to burn from the thickening smoke. The fire was a living thing, a monstrous, hungry beast that consumed everything in its path. It moved with terrifying speed, the roar growing louder, the heat becoming a physical presence that slapped at their faces. Flames, 100 feet high, licked at the dark sky. "We have to try to save the house," Luke yelled over the roar. "Beat at the edges. Do not let the embers catch." They fought with a desperate, primal fury. They beat at the encroaching flames with the wet blankets, the heat scorching their skin, the smoke a choking, blinding fog. Embers rained down around them like fiery snow, igniting the dry grass in a dozen new places at once. It was a hopeless, terrifying battle against an enemy that could not be beaten. Clara worked beside him, her arms aching, her lungs on fire. She held Emma's small hand, keeping the terrified child close to her side, shielding her face with her own body. They were losing. The fire swept past them, engulfing the last of the parched pasture and licking at the old, dry timbers of the remaining barn structure. The building, a skeleton of charred beams from the first fire, went up in an instant, an explosion of light and heat, a massive, burning crossbeam groaned and then broke free from its mooring. Clara saw it falling, a black spar against the wall of flame, but she was frozen, her mind unable to process the danger. Luke shouted her name. He moved faster than she had ever seen him move, closing the distance between them in 2 great strides. He shoved her and Emma to the ground, covering them with his own body as the massive timber crashed down exactly where they had been standing, sending a shower of sparks and hot ash into the air. He lay over her for a moment, his heart hammering against her back. The heat was immense. The air was unbreathable. "We have to go!" he yelled, his voice raw. He scooped Clara into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Grab Emma!" Clara, dazed, grabbed her daughter's hand, and he ran. He carried her through the smoke and the heat, away from the inferno that had been their home, his powerful legs eating up the ground. He did not stop until they reached the relative safety of the dry creek bed, where he collapsed with her onto the cool stones, all 3 of them gasping for air, their faces black with soot, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. The fire raged on, but the wind shifted, pushing the main wall of flames away from the house and on across the empty plains. The house, miraculously, was spared. But the barn, the last of the fences, and what was left of the pasture were all gone, leaving behind a smoldering, blackened wasteland. They sat there for hours, watching the fire burn itself out on the horizon. They did not speak. There were no words for what they had just survived. As the false dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of gray, a profound exhaustion settled over them. Emma had fallen asleep, her head in Clara's lap. Luke finally stirred. He looked at the devastation around them, his face a mask of utter despair. Everything was gone. He was ruined. He looked at Clara, at her soot-stained face and her torn, scorched dress. He looked at Emma, safe in her arms. He reached out a trembling hand and touched Clara's cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a smudge of ash.
I thought I lost you,
he whispered, his voice cracking, stripped bare of all its defenses. When I saw that beam fall, I thought I lost you. His eyes, stark in his blackened face, filled with tears. I cannot lose you too. The words were a confession, an admission of a truth he had been fighting for months. He leaned in, and this time, he did not pull away. He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate and raw, born of terror and relief. It was the kiss of 2 survivors clinging to each other in the wreckage of their world. It tasted of smoke and ash and tears, and it was the most real, most honest thing Clara had ever felt. She kissed him back with all the fear and longing and love that was in her, her arms wrapping around his neck, holding on as if she might be swept away. In the soot and the darkness, surrounded by the ruins of his ranch, they finally found each other. The weeks that followed the fire were a strange and beautiful dream. The kiss had broken the last of the barriers between them. The shared trauma had burned away the ghosts of the past, leaving only the present. They lived as a family. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, clearing away the wreckage, their hands often brushing, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. Luke began to rebuild, and he began to laugh again. The sound, no longer rusty, became a common occurrence, sparked by a funny face Emma made or a dry comment from Clara. His smile transformed his face, chasing away the shadows and revealing the kind, gentle man from the letters she had received so long ago. Emma blossomed in the new warmth of the house, her chatter filling the rooms, her questions endless. She called Clara Mama without hesitation, and Luke no longer flinched when he heard it. He would just smile, a sad but beautiful smile of acceptance. They were poor, they had lost almost everything, but they were happy. They ate their simple meals together. They talked by the fire in the evenings. And one night, he took her hand and led her to his room. Their coming together was as quiet and natural as breathing, a final healing of 2 lonely souls. For the first time in her life, Clara felt wanted. She felt loved. She felt home. The dream was shattered by a rumor, carried from town by the blacksmith, who had ridden out to see if they needed help. There is a man in town, Luke, the blacksmith, a kind man named Samuel, said, his face troubled. He is asking after your Clara. Says he is her fiancée from back in Missouri. Clara, who was pumping water nearby, froze, the handle of the pump slipping from her grasp, a cold dread, a terror she thought she had left behind forever, seized her. It could not be. Not him. Luke's face hardened. Her fiancé, that cannot be right. He is telling a nasty story, Samuel continued, looking uncomfortable. Says she robbed him, cleaned out his savings and ran off. He is talking to Sheriff Miller about it. The world tilted on its axis. No, it was a lie, a vicious, twisted lie. After Samuel left, the happy peace of the ranch was gone, replaced by a tense, ugly silence. Luke would not look at her. He went about his chores, his jaw tight, his movements jerky with a barely controlled anger. The laughter was gone. The tenderness was gone. In their place was the cold wall of suspicion. That evening, he confronted her. Emma was asleep. The house was quiet. "Is it true?" he demanded, his voice low and hard. "This man, is he who he says he is?" Clara could not speak. She could only nod, her whole body trembling. "And the money?" he pressed, his eyes boring into her. "Did you steal from him?" "No!" The word was torn from her, a cry of anguish. "No, I never! He is lying!" "Then why is he here?" Luke's voice rose, laced with the pain of betrayal. "Why is a man claiming to be your fiancé accusing you of being a thief? You need to tell me the truth. Clara, all of it." The moment she had dreaded her entire life was here. She had to tell him. She had to show him the ugly, shameful truth of her past, and risk losing the only happiness she had ever known. Tears streamed down her face as the story poured out of her, a torrent of humiliation and fear she had kept locked away for years. She told him about Mr. Albright, about his promises and her own foolish, desperate belief in them. She told him about the broken engagement, and then she told him the rest of it, the part she had never told anyone. "He did not just break the engagement," she whispered, her voice shaking so badly she could barely form the words. He was not a good man. When I tried to end it, he became angry. He said I owed him. He hit me. Luke." She looked down at her hands, remembering. "He locked me in my room. He said I was his property and he would not let me go. I was so scared. I waited until he was gone one day. And I ran. I took nothing but the clothes on my back and the $7 I had saved. I did not steal from him. I escaped from him." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for him to believe her. "I was so ashamed. I came west to start over, to be someone new. I never thought he would follow me here." Luke stared at her, his face a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. He saw the terror in her eyes, the truth of her words resonating in every trembling line of her body. He believed her, but he also saw the sheriff, the law, and the word of a man against the word of a woman the town already considered fallen. He was torn between the fierce, protective instinct to stand by her and the cold, practical fear of what the world would do to her. The law did not often side with women like Clara. His silence was her answer. He believed her, but he was afraid. The knowledge was a new kind of heartbreak. They did not have to wait long. The next morning, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. It was Sheriff Miller, and beside him, a well-dressed man with a cruel, handsome face that Clara recognized with a jolt of pure terror. Mr. Albright. They rode into the yard and dismounted. Sheriff Miller looked grim. "Mr.?" Albright smiled, a smug, triumphant smile. Luke came to stand on the porch, placing himself in front of Clara. Emma, sensing the terrible tension, ran and clung to Clara's skirt, her small face buried in the folds. "Luke," the sheriff said, his voice heavy. This is Mr. Silas Albright. He has sworn out a complaint against Miss Hastings. He has a warrant for her arrest on charges of theft and fraud." "She did not do it," Luke said, his voice a low growl.
"This man is lying. Mr.
Albright laughed. "Is that so? Or is it that you have been taken in by her pretty face and her sob stories, just like I was? She is a cunning thief. Garver, she will ruin you."
Get off my land,"
Luke said, taking a step forward. "Now, Luke, do not make this difficult," the sheriff warned, placing a hand on the butt of his pistol. "I have a warrant. I have to do my duty. I have to take her in." Two deputies who had ridden up behind them moved onto the porch. Clara felt their hands on her arms, their grip firm and impersonal. It was happening. Her past had finally caught her and was dragging her back into the darkness.
"No!"
she cried, trying to pull away.
"Please, I am innocent."
But they were strong. They pulled her off the porch, away from Luke, away from her home. Emma began to scream. It was not a child's cry, but a wild, piercing shriek of pure terror and loss.
"Mama, Mama, no, Mama!"
Clara twisted in the deputy's grasp, trying to get back to her, her heart shattering into a million pieces at the sound of that scream.
"Emma, it is all right. My baby, it is all right."
But it was not all right. They dragged her toward a horse, and as they pulled her up into the saddle, she looked back. Luke was standing on the porch, frozen, his face a mask of helpless agony. And Emma was on the ground, her small body convulsed with sobs, her arms reaching out for a mother who was being taken away. The jail in Red Hollow was a small, suffocating box of stone and iron. It consisted of 2 cells at the back of the sheriff's office, separated from the business of the law by a single, heavy wooden door. Clara's world shrank to the 4 damp walls of her cell, the straw-stuffed mattress that smelled of mildew and despair, and the single high barred window that showed her nothing but a sliver of unforgiving blue sky. Time became a slow, syrupy drip, measured only by the changing slant of the light through that narrow opening. Her arrest had been a public spectacle, and the town reveled in it. Her pleas of innocence were met with cold, hard stares. She was no longer just an unfortunate mail-order bride. She was a criminal, a living embodiment of the sin the Reverend Brand had been railing against. The men of the town, who had once looked at her with a crude sort of interest, now looked at her with open disgust, as if her very presence contaminated the air they breathed. When Sheriff Miller brought her meager meals of stale bread and watery stew, she could feel their eyes on her through the open door to his office, their muttered comments like stones thrown at her cage. Silas Albright was a master of his craft. He did not hide or shy away from the attention. He cultivated it. He spent his days in the saloon and his evenings at the eatery, spinning his venomous tale to any who would listen. He painted a picture of himself as a wronged and heartbroken man, a respectable gentleman from Missouri who had been charmed and then ruthlessly fleeced by a cunning, immoral woman. He spoke of his life savings, stolen from him in the dead of night. He hinted at promises she had made and then broken, seducing him only to betray him. His story was a lie, but it was a simple, satisfying lie that confirmed everything the town already wanted to believe about her. The Reverend Brand, smelling the scent of brimstone, seized upon the scandal. From his tent pulpit, he thundered about the serpent in their midst, a curse to decent men, a painted Jezebel sent to test their moral fortitude. He did not use her name, but everyone knew who he meant. Clara could sometimes hear the fevered pitch of his voice carrying on the evening air, and she would press her hands over her ears. But she could not block out the poison. The town's judgment was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on her soul. On the 3rd night, long after the town had gone quiet, she heard a soft scratching at the barred window of the cell door. She looked up from her mattress to see Luke's face in the flickering lamplight from the sheriff's empty office. He had a key. The sheriff, for all his gruffness, was not a cruel man and had likely turned a blind eye. He looked terrible. The bruises from his fight had deepened to ugly shades of purple and yellow, and his eyes were hollowed out with exhaustion and worry. He passed a bundle wrapped in cloth through the bars. It was fresh bread, a piece of cheese, and an apple. It was a feast. "You have to eat," he said, his voice a low whisper. She took the food, but her appetite was gone. All she could feel was a crushing guilt. "Luke, you should not be here. You should not be doing this. They will say you are helping a criminal. Think of Emma. Think of your reputation." "I have no reputation left to think of," he said, a bitter smile touching his swollen lips. "They will ruin you," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please, do not ruin yourself for me. Go home to your daughter. Forget about me." He reached through the bars, his fingers finding hers, his calloused palm a shock of warmth in the cold cell. He looked at her then, his gaze so intense it seemed to strip away every lie and every fear, leaving only the raw, aching truth. "You already ruined me," he said, his voice soft but fierce. "For 2 years, I was a dead man walking. I worked and I breathed, but I was not alive. I was just waiting for it all to be over." He squeezed her hand. "You came here and you woke me up. You made me want to live again. So do not ask me to forget you. It is too late for that." His words were a brand on her heart, a declaration of love so profound it left her breathless. It was the most beautiful and the most painful thing anyone had ever said to her, a promise of heaven from the depths of her own private hell. He stayed for a few more minutes, their hands clasped through the bars in silence, and then he was gone, melting back into the darkness, leaving her with the scent of his skin and the taste of his words. What he did not tell her was the state of things back at the ranch. Emma, upon witnessing Clara's arrest, had retreated back into her world of silence. The word mama was locked away again, perhaps forever. She refused to eat, refused to play. She spent her days sitting in the chair by the front window, the one where Clara used to sit to do her mending. She clutched the worn gray shawl Clara had left behind, holding it to her face, breathing in the faint scent of the woman who was gone. She just sat and watched the empty road, her small face a mask of sorrow, waiting for a return that never came. Luke's heart broke every time he looked at her. He saw 2 futures laid out before him, one where Clara was sent away to prison and his daughter faded away into silence forever, and another, a near impossible one, where he could somehow prove Clara's innocence. He chose the impossible. He left Emma in the care of a reluctant but not unkind Mrs. Dwyer, promising the innkeeper he would be back in a few days. He saddled his best horse, a sturdy buckskin, and rode west, toward the county seat of Clayton, a full day's ride away. It was a bigger, more established town, with a courthouse and a main telegraph office. If Silas Albright was who he claimed to be, there might be a record of him. If he was a liar, there might be a record of that, too. He spent 2 days in Clayton, a man consumed by a single purpose. He spoke to the county sheriff, a methodical, weary man who listened to Luke's story with a practiced skepticism. He haunted the telegraph office, sending inquiries to lawmen in every major town in Missouri, asking about a man named Silas Albright. The replies that came back were slow and mostly fruitless. He felt time slipping through his fingers, each tick of the clock a step closer to Clara being handed over to whatever brutal justice awaited her. He was about to give up, his spirit ground down by frustration and failure, when the Clayton sheriff called him over. The sheriff was pinning new wanted posters to a board in his office, circulars that had just arrived on the afternoon stage. "Garver," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "This name you are asking about? Albright? It rings a bell." He tapped a poster near the bottom of the board. "But the man I know of who operates in Missouri does not use that name. He goes by Silas Blackwood, or sometimes Simon Abernathy. A known swindler, specializes in defrauding women of their savings. We have had a poster on him for months." Luke's heart hammered in his chest. He looked at the poster. The sketch was crude, but the eyes were right. The cruel set of the mouth was unmistakable. It was him. Silas Blackwood, also known as Albright, wanted in 3 states for fraud and larceny. The poster mentioned he had a wife and 4 children in St. Louis, a fact he used to garner sympathy from his victims. The sheriff saw the look on Luke's face. "That your man?" "That is him," Luke said, his voice tight with a cold, righteous fury. He ripped the poster from the board. "I need this." "That is official property," the sheriff started to say, but seeing the look in Luke's eyes, he just sighed. "Go on. Get out of here. Looks like you have a long ride ahead of you." Luke rode out of Clayton like a man possessed, the wanted poster tucked safely inside his shirt. He pushed his horse hard, the setting sun at his back. His mind focused on one thing, getting back to Red Hollow, getting back to Clara. He had the proof. He could save her. He rode through most of the night, stopping only to let his horse drink. He was so close. He could almost feel the relief, the victory. But Silas Albright, or Blackwood, was not a man who left things to chance. He had seen Luke ride out of town, and he had guessed his destination and his purpose. He was not about to let a dirt-poor rancher undo his carefully laid plans. The ambush happened in a narrow, rocky canyon about 10 miles from Red Hollow. The moon was down, and the trail was shrouded in darkness. They were waiting for him. 2 of them, hired thugs from the saloon, men whose loyalty could be bought for the price of a bottle of whiskey. They stepped out from behind the rocks, one grabbing his horse's bridle, the other pulling Luke from the saddle. He fought back, his fists flying, but he was exhausted from his long ride. And there were 2 of them. They overwhelmed him quickly, beating him with a vicious, methodical brutality. They kicked him when he was down, their heavy boots thudding into his ribs and his stomach. He curled into a ball, his arms protecting his head, his mind focused on the precious paper inside his shirt. One of the men knelt and went through his pockets, looking for money. He found the poster. "What is this?" he grunted, squinting at it in the dark. "Does not matter," the other one said. "We were paid to stop him. He is stopped." They kicked him one last time for good measure and then melted back into the rocks, leaving him bleeding and broken in the dust of the trail. Days passed in Red Hollow. 3, 4, 5. There was no word from Luke. Clara's hope, which had burned so brightly after his visit, began to flicker and die. Each morning she woke to the same stone walls, the same sliver of sky. Each evening she watched the shadows lengthen, and he did not come. Sheriff Miller grew impatient. "Mr. Albright is getting anxious to leave," he told her one morning, his tone apologetic but firm. "The circuit judge will be through Clayton next week. I have to transport you there to await trial. We will leave tomorrow morning." Clara's world collapsed. Tomorrow. It was over. Luke was not coming back. She sank onto her cot, a cold, terrible certainty settling in her heart. He had abandoned her, and she could not even blame him. He had a daughter to think of. Why should he ruin his life and Emma's for a woman with a shameful past, a woman who had brought nothing but trouble to his door? He had tried, and he had failed, and now he had made the sensible choice. He had gone back to his ranch to save what was left of his family. The thought was a pain sharper than any beating. She had found a home, only to lose it. She had found love, only to be abandoned. It was the story of her life. The morning of her departure dawned gray and cool. The sky wept a miserable, drizzling rain. Sheriff Miller unlocked her cell, his face grim. "It is time, Miss Hastings." She walked in a daze out into the main office. Silas Albright was there, looking smug and impatient, dressed in a fine traveling coat. He smiled when he saw her, a cruel, triumphant smirk. Outside, a wagon was waiting to take her away, to begin the long journey toward a prison cell. This was the end. And then they heard it, A horse, moving at a stumbling, agonizingly slow walk. A figure on horseback emerged from the misty rain at the end of the street. It was a man, slumped over in the saddle, barely able to stay upright. The horse, a familiar buckskin, was lathered and exhausted, its head hanging low. The rider was caked in dried blood and mud, his clothes torn to shreds. He clung to the saddle horn with one hand, and in the other, he clutched a crumpled, dirty piece of paper. As the horse finally came to a stop in front of the sheriff's office, the rider slid from the saddle, collapsing in a heap in the muddy street. It was Luke. Sheriff Miller and his deputy rushed outside. Clara, her heart in her throat, pushed past them. She fell to her knees in the mud beside him. His face was a swollen, unrecognizable mask of bruises and cuts. One arm was bent at an unnatural angle. His breathing was a shallow, rattling gasp. He was dying. He had crawled his way back from the dead to get to her. His eyes fluttered open and found hers. He tried to speak, but only a bloody froth came from his lips. He pushed the crumpled paper into her hand. His eyes then moved to the sheriff, who was kneeling beside him. With the last of his strength, he whispered one word, a word that was both a plea and a command. Innocent. And then his eyes closed, and he went limp. The world erupted into chaos. Clara screamed his name, convinced he was dead. The sheriff, his face pale with shock, took the crumpled paper from her shaking hand. He smoothed it out. It was the wanted poster. He stared at it, then at the stunned face of Silas Albright, who had begun to back away slowly. "Blackwood," the sheriff said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Well, I will be." He drew his pistol. "Do not you move a muscle." But Albright, or Blackwood, was already running, scrambling for his horse. The deputy fired a shot into the air, but the swindler was gone, disappearing into the rain-swept street, a coward fleeing the truth. The truth, however, spread through Red Hollow like wildfire. The story passed from person to person. The mail-order bride was innocent. The man from Missouri was a wanted criminal, and Luke Garver had nearly died to prove it. They carried Luke into the inn, to the best room misses. The doctor was summoned. A grim-faced man who shook his head as he examined the extent of the injuries. 3 broken ribs, a broken arm, a severe concussion, and countless cuts and bruises. He had lost a great deal of blood. His chances, the doctor said, were not good. Clara, her name cleared, her freedom restored, did not leave his side. The jail cell was replaced by a sick room, her fear for herself replaced by a terror for him. She sat in a chair by his bed, a silent, tireless sentinel. She bathed his feverish head with cool water. She held his hand, whispering his name, begging him to come back to her. She prayed by candlelight through the long, dark nights, her prayers a desperate, unending stream of bargains with a God she hoped was listening. He had ruined himself for her, just as she had feared. He had made himself want to live again, only to have his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. She would not lose him now. She could not. The days that followed were a long, slow climb out of a deep, dark valley. Luke Garver clung to life by a thread, and Clara was the one who held it. She lived in the small room at the inn, but her world was the space around his bed. She learned the rhythms of his fever, the shallow rasp of his breathing, the way his hand would twitch in the throes of a nightmare. She became his anchor in a sea of pain and delirium, her voice a constant, soothing presence, her touch a reminder that he was not alone. The town, which had so recently been her tormentor, watched her vigil with a mixture of awe and shame. The story of Luke's ride, of the wanted poster clutched in his hand as he collapsed, had stripped away their self-righteous certainty. They had been wrong, cruelly and publicly so. In Clara's tireless devotion, they saw not the fallen woman of the preacher's sermons, but a strength and loyalty that shamed their own petty judgments. The change was slow, but it was real. It began with Mrs. Dwyer, who started leaving trays of food outside Luke's door for Clara, never saying a word but her eyes communicating a deep, weary respect. Then the blacksmith, Samuel, came, his hat in his hands, offering to look after Luke's horse. Mrs. Bishop, the same woman who had led the charge to run her out of town, appeared one afternoon with a jar of beef broth, her face stiff with a shame she could not voice. She set it on the table and left without a word. They were small gestures, offerings of atonement from a town wrestling with its conscience. Luke's recovery was a journey measured in inches. The first time he opened his eyes and knew who she was. Clara wept with a relief so profound it left her weak. His broken body began to mend, the bones knitting, the bruises fading. But it was the wounds inside that were slowest to heal. He was quiet and withdrawn. The trauma of the ambush and the weight of what he had almost lost leaving a deep shadow on his soul. It was spring when the doctor finally declared him well enough to go home. The day they left the inn, the townspeople did not stare with hostility, but with a quiet, respectful deference. Clara sat beside Luke in the wagon, a mended man at her side, and a silent, watchful Emma sitting close to her. As they rode out of Red Hollow, she saw the Reverend Brand's tent was gone. His fire and brimstone had lost their appeal in the face of real sacrifice and true grace. The land they returned to was a place of resurrection. The drought had broken with a series of gentle, life-giving spring rains. The blackened, scarred earth, which had looked so utterly dead, was now veiled in a delicate mist of new green. Tiny, courageous shoots pushed their way through the ash and the cracked soil. The creek, which had been a dry wound, now gurgled with clear, cold water. The world was healing, and it offered them a quiet promise that they could heal too. They set about rebuilding their lives, and this time, they did it together. The work was hard, but it was hopeful work. Friends of Luke's from neighboring ranches, men who had kept their distance during the scandal, now rode over to help him rebuild the barn and the fences. A silent apology and a reaffirmation of frontier solidarity. Clara worked alongside them, her hands now as capable as any man's, and she earned their respect, not with words, but with the steady, quiet competence of her labor. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The house, once a place of ghosts and silence, was now filled with the sound of Emma's chatter. The little girl, with Clara home and her father safe, had found her voice again, and she used it with the joyful abandon of a bird uncaged. She followed Clara everywhere, a small, bright shadow, her questions and observations a constant, happy melody. But a question still lay unspoken in the heart of their small, makeshift family. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in soft strokes of lavender and rose, Emma came in from the fields. Her hands were full of wildflowers, purple lupine, yellow primrose, and the delicate white bells of the yucca plant. She had arranged them into a messy, beautiful bouquet. She walked directly to Clara, who was sitting on the porch steps, and held them out.
"For you, Mama,"
she said, her voice clear and sweet. Clara took the flowers, her throat tight with emotion. She looked at the child, at her earnest, loving face, and then she looked at Luke. He was leaning against the porch railing, watching them, his face unreadable in the gathering dusk. Emma seemed to sense the weight of the moment. She looked from Clara to her father, and then back to Clara. She reached out and took Clara's hand, her small fingers curling around one of Clara's.
"Can you be my mommy?"
she whispered, the question that had started it all. But this time it was not a child's bewildered plea, but a hopeful, heartfelt request. Tears filled Clara's eyes. She did not know how to answer. Her gaze remained on Luke, her heart hanging suspended in the quiet evening air. This was his decision. It had to be his. She was the woman his daughter called mother, the woman he had nearly died for, the woman he loved, But she was not Sarah. She would never be Sarah. Luke looked at them, at the woman who had resurrected his life and the child who was the heart of it. He saw the ghosts of the past, the pain and the loss that would always be a part of their story. But he also saw the present, this incredible, unhoped-for gift of a second chance. He saw a future. He pushed himself off the railing and walked over to them. He knelt, so that he was eye level with his daughter, but his gaze was on Clara, and in his eyes she saw not the shadow of his first wife, but the bright, steady light of his love for her. He nodded, just a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was all the answer she needed. The tears in her eyes overflowed, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She pulled Emma into her arms, burying her face in the child's straw-colored hair, the scent of wildflowers and sunshine filling her senses.
"Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes, my sweet girl. Yes."
Luke's hand came to rest on her shoulder, his touch warm and firm, and in that moment, under the first pale stars of the evening, they were no longer three broken souls. They were a family. They were married a week later. There was no church, no preacher, no crowd of well-wishers. They stood under the shade of an ancient cottonwood tree down by the creek, a place where the new grass grew thick and green. Mrs. Dwyer came out from town to be their witness, her weary face lit with a genuine, happy smile. Emma stood between them, holding both of their hands. Luke's vows were simple and direct, spoken in his low, steady voice. Clara's were a whispered promise, her voice thick with a happiness so profound it was almost painful. When he kissed her, it was not with the desperation of their first kiss in the ashes, but with a deep, tender certainty. It was a kiss that promised a lifetime of quiet mornings and shared sunsets. Months passed, the seasons turned, the ranch, under their combined care, began to prosper. The new barn stood tall and proud, smelling of fresh-cut pine. A new herd of cattle, smaller but healthier, grazed in the rebuilt pastures. Clara's garden overflowed with vegetables, and chickens scratched in the yard. Their life was not one of riches, but it was a life of abundance. The house was filled with the smell of baking bread, the sound of Emma's laughter, and the quiet comfort of a love that had been tested by fire and found to be true. The town of Red Hollow became a place of friends, not enemies. Clara could ride to the general store and be greeted with warm smiles. The women who had once scorned her now sought her advice on canning and mending. They had all learned a hard lesson about judgment, and in doing so, had found a better version of themselves. One cool autumn evening, a comfortable domesticity had settled over the ranch house. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow over the room. Emma was curled up on the rug at Clara's feet, her small brow furrowed in concentration as Clara patiently guided her finger over the words in a primer. "The cat sat on the mat," Emma read, her voice filled with the pride of her new accomplishment. Luke sat in his chair nearby, oiling a piece of harness, but he was not looking at his work. He was watching them, his family, bathed in the golden firelight. He watched the lamplight catch the soft brown of Clara's hair. He watched the intense focus on his daughter's face, and a feeling of peace so deep it felt like prayer settled over him. He had been given a gift he never thought he deserved, a grace he had done nothing to earn. Yet, even in this profound peace, the memories of the past remained. They were not haunting ghosts anymore, but quiet, lingering shadows, scars that testified to the wounds they had survived. He would never forget the scent of smoke and the terror of the fire. Clara would never forget the cold stone of the jail cell and the sting of humiliation. The loneliness that had shaped both of them was now a part of their story, a shared history that gave their present happiness its depth and its meaning. They knew how precious their peace was because they knew what it was like to live without it. On an evening that marked the anniversary of their quiet wedding, they walked together down to the creek, the place where they had made their promises. The sun was setting, bleeding glorious shades of orange, pink and gold across the vast western sky. Emma ran ahead of them, her small, sturdy legs carrying her effortlessly over the familiar ground, her laughter echoing in the still air as she chased a firefly. Luke reached out and took Clara's hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a simple, familiar gesture that still made her heart stir. He stopped and turned to her, his face illuminated by the beautiful, dying light. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw in his eyes the long, hard road they had traveled. "I was wrong. You know," he said softly, "that first day, when you were waiting at the depot, I never sent for you, but you were meant to be here." He squeezed her hand, his gaze holding hers. "You were wanted, Clara, always, even before I knew it myself." His words were the final, healing balm on the oldest wound of her soul. She, the orphan, the unwanted, the abandoned, had found the one place in the world where she truly belonged. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching their daughter play. Emma ran through the golden light, her arms outstretched as if to embrace the whole world, her silhouette dark against the magnificent sunset, and her laughter, clear and bright and fearless, echoed across the quiet land, a sound that was pure and whole, a sound that felt like grace after too much grief. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect. We invite you to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.